Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to give you a quick introduction video to a new bamboo of mine. Now this bamboo is called Chusquea gigantea. Now this is a particularly rare bamboo but also a very sought after bamboo. This is probably the largest clumping bamboo that you can grow in a temperate climate, or at least a climate similar to the UK. So normally with most bamboos, if you want to grow a giant bamboo with really thick canes and good height, it needs to be a running bamboo if you're in a cold temperate climate. If you're in the tropics you have a lot more choice and you can easily find a clumping bamboo that can grow to a good size. Here in places like the UK where it's more temperate, if you want a clumping variety you really have to stick with Fargesia and a few other species. There's not many species that are clumping. Most of the big bamboos are like the Phylostachys, which are running bamboos. And the problem with the Fargesia bamboos, although there's a lot to choose from and there's quite a lot nice looking varieties, the stems are quite thin and you don't normally have many giant varieties. And the reason you want to go for a clumping variety is because if you have a running one, it can spread really fast, very quickly underground with running rhizomes, and unless you install a bamboo barrier it can very quickly take over your whole garden and your neighbour's garden. So this one, as I say, is a very unusual bamboo because it's a clumping bamboo but it can grow to a decent size. So it can grow up to 15 meters in height, probably only about 8 or 10 in my climate, but I'll give it the best conditions I can and I'll see how large it will grow. It's also hardy down to about minus 18 degrees Celsius, which for a clumping bamboo that can get this large is very unusual. So the reason this is hardy is because it comes from Chile. It comes from the south of Chile where it gets quite cold, so it has got the hardiness that it needs. Another interesting thing about this and any other bamboo from the genus Chusquea is that the canes are actually solid. So with most bamboos the canes are hollow and they're only solid at the nodes, but with this variety they're actually solid throughout the whole cane, so the canes are a lot stronger than they would be for that diameter. So partly because of that, this variety is actually very good in coastal locations. It's very good at handling the strong winds and it's relatively tolerant to the salt spray as well. So I'll be growing this one probably in my parents' garden eventually, and because it's not running it means I can have it contained quite easily. And being such a sought after plant, you think it would be quite common, a lot of nurseries would grow it, but there's a few reasons why this is a very rare bamboo and it's not widely in cultivation. Part of the reason is because it is from Chile, so it's a little bit harder to find. It's less well known to the horticultural world because it hasn't been produced in large numbers until more recently. And another reason is because it's very hard to propagate. Most bamboos grow very shallow roots at the surface and you can easily divide them, but this variety actually grows surprisingly deep roots, so it's quite hard to separate. You have to dig down quite deep, you have to have very deep pots, and which really makes it quite hard to separate. And until recently there wasn't any juvenile plants, so because this is a juvenile plant it'll be quite a lot easier to separate because it's not going to have very deep roots. It's still quite a young plant, but a few years ago there wasn't any juvenile plants, they were all mature plants and it was very hard to separate them, so they were very hard to come by. And another reason why this was probably the rarest bamboo in the world just a couple of years ago is because they all went to flower. What happens with most bamboos is they don't flower for most of their lifetime, and then right at the end of the lifetime, it could be 40 years, it could be 100 years or more, but they'll grow for that time all around the world. All the same plants from the same batch of seeds will grow. They won't flower for the whole lifespan, and then they'll just all flower at one time in the same year or over the course of 2 or 3 years. And this happened to this species 2 or 3 years ago. To every single plant of its type around the whole world went to flower. They all died after flowering as well, which meant that there was none of these plants left in the entire world apart from seedlings. So what's happening now is a lot of people have collected the seeds and they're starting to sell the seedlings, and this is what this is. This is I think a 2-year-old seedling of a Chusquea gigantea, and as you can see it's growing quite well now, but it is still quite a small plant. So these will become a lot more common in the next few years because the plants are juvenile, they're easy to separate and propagate, and because people have been collecting hundreds or maybe thousands of seedlings, there's going to be a lot coming onto the market soon. But for now it's still a very rare bamboo, but in a few years time this will probably be a very popular one. Another nice thing about this Chusquea gigantea is the canes. They're very thick and tall canes for a hardy clumping variety, but they also have a really nice colour. So they don't really sow it yet because this is a juvenile one, but when they do grow, canes are bright yellow, and around the nodes where the shoots come out of, it's got a nice green colour. So it's got that lovely two-tone effect, which makes the canes a really interesting feature. A bit more about my individual plant. So I got this at the beginning of summer It was very leggy. I think it was growing in a lower light environment and with a lot of shelter, so the canes are very thin and the leaves are rather yellow. I'll show you some photos. Unfortunately, this is a few weeks after I got it, so it was already starting to perk up and look a bit different, but you should see it's quite a bit different to what it looks like now at the end of summer. So I'll now give you a closer look at the bamboo. So basically all the original canes were these ones that are flopped over the side. Because it was in a low light environment, they were very long, thin canes. They couldn't support their own weight and they all fell over. What happened is when I got it, it was in a very small pot, so I repotted it into this larger one straight away to make sure it had plenty of root space. Being a deep-rooted variety of bamboo, it needs a large pot. Ideally I need to get a deeper pot, so I'll probably be repotting this next spring, ready for the next growing season. And you can see here, the original canes that had flopped over, what they've done is they've all grown lots of new shoots. So you can see along there, along the canes, there's lots of new shoots coming up. So that's all this year's growth. This cane at the beginning of the spring only had these leaves that you can see hanging down, so it was very sparse with leaves, and there's growing all these new shoots coming up here. Now when it comes to other species of bamboo, they're often a bit more like this branch here, but imagine if they were going straight up like that, where they have 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4 shoots coming from each node. Now one of the things with the Chusquea bamboos is they grow quite differently. This young one here doesn't show it because it's a very young cane and there is only 1 to 3 or 5 shoots coming from each node here. But when they're mature plants, they actually have 10 or 20 shoots and they're much shorter than a normal bamboo. That gives each cane a much bushier appearance, and it gives it quite a different appearance than most types of bamboo. So since this has been growing, this has been starting to grow some much more mature type canes. You can see these ones here are thicker, stronger, are starting to support their own weight, and some of them are actually showing that more branch structure. So this one here, for example, further down you can see each node where it comes out there's multiple shoots, but I have actually got some slightly more mature ones that I can show you, which are really starting to show it off better. So these ones down the bottom here, you can see at each node there's probably 5 or 10 shoots coming out. It's just bursting with loads of shoots, and that's, as I say, it's quite unusual for bamboo, or at least not for Phyllostachus species, but as I say, for the Chusquea, they tend to have loads of shoots out of each node, and that will just give it a much bushier appearance. So I'm very happy with how this is done. As I say, when I first got it, it was just that straggly appearance, and then it started putting up all these new shoots, which were still a bit weak and weren't that strong, but it's interesting to see how fast this is sizing up. So you can see how thin the old shoots were. They're probably just 1 or 2 millimeters in thickness, but these new ones are probably about 3 or 4 millimeters, maybe getting close to 5 in some cases, some of these slightly thicker ones. So it's very rapidly sizing up, and the thing is, most of these shoots appeared over the summer, and bamboo normally puts on its shooting phase in the spring, so the biggest shoots you normally get are in springtime. What most bamboos do is they grow over the summer, put all their energy into dormant shoots in the autumn time, and then it's those dormant shoots in autumn time that come up in spring and provide the growth. Now because these shoots were so thin and straggly, this is a good example of what most of them look like this spring. The plant was quite weak, so when it did start growing, it only had the energy to produce these shoots here, but they're surprisingly thick considering how weak that plant was in the previous year. So because this whole plant is now nice and strong and healthy, I should expect some really large canes starting to come up, or at least much bigger than they are now in the next spring. So I'm expecting this to size up really nicely, and I'll actually show you the root system now, and it's interesting to see how much this is sizing up. One way you can tell a bamboo is about to size up quite quickly is how big the roots are. So what I'm going to do now is flip this bamboo over, and I'm going to show you the root system, and you'll be able to see how much the roots have started to thicken up on it. So you can see here, as I say, it's quite a deep rooted bamboo. All the roots are at the bottom of the pot. Normally with most bamboos they're quite shallow rooted, so they would have a lot more of the roots towards the surface. So you can see a lot of these older roots here, they're quite thin. This is what a lot of the roots were like when the bamboo was growing originally. But you can see the newest roots here on the side that are coming down are much thicker. So when the bamboo starts thickening up, it starts to grow lots of much thicker roots. The whole plant starts to size up. Originally when it's young, it'll just grow small roots, and then it'll grow these much larger, thicker roots as it gets older, and eventually the roots could be almost as thick as my small finger. So that's a really sure sign that next year this is going to be a really big bamboo. What's probably going to happen over this autumn is that it'll grow lots of these thicker roots, fill up the space of the pot quite nicely. It'll then put a lot of energy over the autumn and winter into its rhizomes and into its shoot for next spring, and then next spring we should get much larger culms coming up and a much thicker, larger bamboo plant. So it'll be interesting to see how this does. It's done fantastically well for me over the summer, considering how sickly and poorly this plant looked when I first got it. It has really grown well, so I'm really looking forward to how big this might get next year. Another thing to note with this type of bamboo is, although it's not a running bamboo and it is a clumping bamboo, it's what's called like an open clumper, so it doesn't stay really tight. You can see these new shoots, even though it's quite a small plant, they are coming up quite far away from the original plant. So that's because this is an open clumper. The shoots can appear up to a foot away from the existing plant, so it's quite different to my Fargesia plants. So this, for example, is one of my Fargesia clumping bamboos. This one, the original plant is about 5 years old, but I separated this I think 2 years ago, so it's quite a young plant really. And you can see here, it's really a very tight clumping bamboo, so you can see it's all around the center there. There's a few new shoots coming up just at the edge here, but you can see they're only a few millimeters, maybe a centimeter at most, away from any of the existing culms. So that's a really tight type of clumping bamboo, whereas this one here, as I say, is an open clumping bamboo, and the new shoots can appear a foot away. And when this becomes mature, it means, especially when the bamboo canes are large, it means that the bamboo canes aren't tight up against each other and you can see them a bit more nicely, and it just gives it a slightly nicer appearance. Whereas this one here, Fargesia, even as it gets older, it will just be absolutely crammed with bamboo canes, and it just makes it harder to see the individual bamboo canes. So I actually prefer an open clumper. And it is quite different to a runner. A running bamboo, what you can have is you have a long one that shoots along the ground, and the bamboo canes could appear a meter, 2 meters, maybe up to 5 or 10 meters away from the original clump if you're unlucky with a very vigorous running bamboo. So that's the real difference here. So that's all for this video. I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to my Chusquea gigantea, just so you can see how it grows for me over the next few years. So what I'll be doing is I'll be putting this in a bigger pot next year, probably keeping it in my garden for a bit longer, and then when I find a space in my parents' garden, we'll plant it in the ground there, and I'll use it as a windbreak to shelter the garden a bit from the wind.